Is reality structured in such a way that there's continued existence after death, and there are further lives of roughly the same kind as our current ones that we have perhaps lived in the past and may live in the future? That is, are we reincarnated following death? There are some interesting arguments, both philosophical and scientific, that point in that direction. I've covered the question of life after death in some detail in other videos. In this video, I will briefly outline the most important points regarding the question of life after death, but the main focus in the video will be on the question of reincarnation. Research has been conducted in a number of areas relevant to the question of life after death. Particularly, the research on so-called near-death experiences is of considerable interest here. People who are near death or clinically dead and then revived sometimes describe experiences they've had during that condition, leaving their body, going to some other place, and perhaps encountering some loving being of light and reviewing the life they have lived so far. These experiences seem to include some shared elements that can be found across different cultures and historical periods, and they often seem absolutely genuine to the people who have experienced them. Due to the subjective nature of such experiences, it is difficult to verify their authenticity empirically. However, there have been recorded cases of episodes in which individuals have shared specific factual information that has subsequently been verified. Information they seem to have acquired at a time where there were supposedly no brain activity present. These cases are very difficult to explain within a standard materialist worldview. That is, if the only thing that exists in itself is the physical world, and consciousness and experiences are generated by the brain. From a research perspective, no results have been published that can be characterized as irrefutable evidence for either the reality or the unreality of these experiences, but recent research projects tend to orient themselves towards producing empirical evidence. Here, it seems there are good opportunities for further research of the near-death experience phenomenon, which might lead to greater clarity on the matter. Moreover, philosophical arguments in favor of the notion of a continued existence after death are available, if unusual. Making such an argument requires challenging the common perception that materialism is true. Delving into the matter, it turns out that this is not as set in stone as it is often assumed to be. The arguments against materialism may even be stronger than the ones that support it. So, while there is no evidence that decides the question of continued existence after physical death definitively, the question is far more open-ended than it is often assumed to be, and there are significant arguments from both philosophical and scientific standpoints supporting the idea that such a continued existence is possible. Further, if we assume, for the moment, for the sake of argument, that there is life after death, then the possibility of reincarnation arises. Naturally, this notion conflicts with the established materialist viewpoint. However, there are arguments that support it. Among others, this includes its extensive geographical reach. Belief in reincarnation is found in nearly all societies around the world that are not predominantly Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Also, researchers have investigated reports by children who claim to remember previous lives. Typically, children begin speaking about such memories between the ages of 2 and 3 and forget about them again by the age of 6 or 7. More than 2,500 cases have been documented. Of particular interest are the cases in which the child's story has been documented prior to the discovery of a deceased person matching with the child's account. An account like this was offered by a Muslim boy from southern Turkey. When he was 2.5 years old, he began to tell stories about a life he believed he had lived before his current one. However, his parents did not believe him and did not show any further interest in his stories. When he was 6 years old, a researcher from an Australian university wrote down his story, including 22 specific details for the researcher to follow up on. The boy explained that he had been a Christian Armenian man from Istanbul. The boy's family had no ties to the city and were not connected to any Armenians, making it difficult for the researcher to track down anyone fitting that description. Eventually, though, he succeeded. The details matched the life of a man named Karakas, who died in the early 1940s. Specifically, 4 of the boy's pieces of information could not be confirmed or were deemed questionable, while 3 others were partially verified. The remaining 15 details provided by the child were verified as matching the circumstances of that man's life. Among other things, the man's house had 3 floors and was located by a shore near moored boats. A neighboring house was owned by a woman named Isigul. The man only lived in the house for part of the year, and he often carried a rather large leather bag. The researcher considered the child's account to be of a particularly credible nature, as there was a distance of 500 kilometers between the child's home and the places in Istanbul he described, and more than 50 years had passed between Karakas' death and the boy's birth. Thus, it appears to be extremely difficult to explain how this little boy could have come into possession of detailed information about Karakas' life. In another earlier case, a girl, Swanlata Mishra, born in 1948 in Shapur, India, started talking about details from a past life when she was just 3 years old and continued to do so in the years that followed. Her parents didn't believe her story and didn't take any further action. But when she was 10 years old, her account caught the attention of a local professor, which led to an investigation. Swanlata claimed that her previous name was Bia, that she had been born in the Pathak family and had lived in the town of Maihar. She also described several details about the house where Bia had lived. The investigator was able to locate the house, and he later met the Pathak family, whose daughter, Bia Pathak, turned out to have died 9 years before Swanlata was born. Swanlata's family had never lived closer than 100 miles from the Pathak family, and the investigator found no reason to doubt the claims from both families that they had no prior connection. Swanlata's knowledge of Bia's life was tested, and a series of specific details were confirmed to be accurate. Bia had been married, had 2 sons, and her house had been white with black iron bars, located in front of a girls' school with a view of a railroad and a limestone fireplace. The house also had 4 decorated rooms and others still under construction. The family had owned a car, which was quite rare in India at that time. When Swanlata was shown places where Bia had spent time, she recognized them, including the room where Bia had died. On several occasions, Swanlata was introduced to members of Bia's family, often in groups of 11 to 40 people, and she was asked to identify anyone she recognized. Efforts were made to complicate these identifications by introducing false identities, such as Bia's son, or denying correct ones, like Bia's other son. But despite these efforts, Swanlata accurately identified many family members. This included Bia's 4 brothers, 4 sisters-in-law, her husband and 2 sons, as well as others. One of Bia's sons didn't believe in reincarnation and insisted for a full day after Swanlata recognized him that he wasn't her son. But Swanlata stood by her identification, and he eventually gave in, convinced that she was his mother in a new incarnation. Other details from the investigation of Swanlata's knowledge of Bia include an instance where one of Bia's brothers claimed that Bia had lost her front teeth. Svanlata denied this, adding that Bia had gold fillings in her front teeth. The brothers didn't recall this, so they asked their wives, who confirmed it was true. Svanlata made several other claims: that Bia's father had worn a turban, which was not typical for that part of India, that Bia had a sister-in-law who had died before her, that a specific kind of sweet had been Bia's favorite, and that Bia's husband had once taken 1,200 rupees from a box where she kept her money. All these claims were confirmed by the Pathak family, and even Bia's husband admitted that only he and Bia had known about the money incident. However, Svanlata didn't get everything right. She was wrong about the name of the district where Bia's family had lived. The names of Bia's sons were only approximately correct, and she mixed up a name with two other names. Svanlata also claimed that Bia had died of a throat disease, but while Bia had throat problems 3 months before her death, she had been treated for that and ultimately died of a heart condition. Given that 20 years had passed between Bia's death and Svanlata's recounting of the details, from a reincarnation perspective, it could be argued that the few incorrect statements were due to the time gap and the resulting lack of memory precision. From a more skeptical view, the only plausible explanation for Svanlata's extensive knowledge of Bia's life might seem to be collusion between the families. However, the investigators' rigorous methodological approach aimed at minimizing the risk of fraud, combined with the large number of similar documented cases, though usually less spectacular in terms of verifiable detail, argues against this explanation. Barring fraud, such accounts are difficult to explain within a materialist framework. They are generally explained by suggesting that the parents must have known the family the child describes and either consciously or unwittingly passes such information on to the child, or that the child made up the stories and kept telling them because adults seemed interested. In the examples mentioned, especially the first one, these explanations seem highly unlikely, though, especially given the distance and time. Other arguments against this hypothesis regarding shared information include the fact that in some cases where the person had suffered a violent death, the child had a phobia corresponding with the cause of that death. Hydrophobia in a case where the person had drowned, for instance, and which did not appear to have any immediate connection to any of the child's own experiences. Furthermore, the child seemed to behave similarly to the deceased, sharing their interests, the type of food they liked, sometimes even including wanting alcohol and narcotics, and their social behavior. Additionally, the children's claims sometimes contradict the religious or cultural factors that actively impact their lives. For example, religions concerned with reincarnation often share the notion that people were previously animals. However, this phenomenon is hardly ever present in children's recollections. So, the hypothesis that these pieces of information have been passed down from the parents to the children is not especially plausible, and there does not appear to be any well-founded explanations for these accounts within the materialist framework. Thus, this phenomenon would seem to support a hypothesis that reincarnation is real. If reincarnation is real, that would significantly change how we view our life and existence. It's no longer just about this one life, but rather about a perhaps long series of lives. Often, when people talk about reincarnation, concepts like karma or personal ethical development come up, and even the meaning of life itself. So the question of reincarnation, even outside of religious context, touches on deep existential issues and is definitely worth considering seriously. Thanks.